dubbed one of the most dangerous men alive. His name is one that is recognized worldwide. His influence continues to impact aspiring cult leaders and neo-terrorist groups, both of which share his philosophies and aim to follow in his footsteps. Others acknowledge him as an emblem of insanity, violence, and the macabre. My name is Thaddeus, and these are Wolves in Sheep's Clothing. On November 12, 1934, 16-year-old Kathleen Maddox gave birth to Charles Millis Manson, who would grow up to become one of the most infamous criminals in the world. While almost everyone knows his name now, ironically, the name given to him at birth was No Name Maddox. This was due to his mother's desire to include his grandmother in the official naming process. Manson took the last name of Kathleen's then-husband, William Manson, although William's involvement in their lives was rather short-lived. Kathleen and William divorced not long after their return from Ohio to Kentucky, about a year after Charles' birth. Kathleen's story is often subject to speculation and conjecture, but many believe that it was her inept parenting that was largely responsible for Charles' instability in life. While we do not have all of the details, and there are many contradictions there too, we know that she was both a prostitute and an alcoholic that had a variety of legal troubles, including criminal activity of her own, which ultimately led to her separation from Charles at a very young age. Despite his mother's negligence, Manson adored her. However, she landed herself in jail in 1939 while Manson was still a child, and he was forced to live with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia during her absence. Upon Kathleen's release 3 years later, she and Manson were reunited and bounced around hotel rooms for a few years. Manson described the first few weeks after her release as the happiest time of his life. But during this time, Kathleen discovered the petty criminal that her son had become while she was incarcerated. What is it that they say about karma? He was stealing, skipping classes, and supposedly even set fire to one of his schools at the age of 9. Eventually, she was unable to handle his erratic behavior alongside her own and sent him off to a Catholic school for delinquents around the age of 12 or 13. Over the course of the next 20 years, Manson found himself back and forth between life trapped in the reform schools, which he despised, and living on the streets via his own means, when he wasn't incarcerated for a multitude of criminal activities. Manson was constantly trying to escape the reform schools, and sometimes he would succeed, only to be sent back later by his mother et al. There are rumors that he was subject to physical and sexual abuse at one or more of said schools, sometimes under the encouragement of staff. The trauma of such experiences undoubtedly contributed to the mangling of his twisted psyche. Manson developed a self-defense technique he entitled the Insane Game. When he was unable to defend himself, he would screech and grimace and frantically wave his arms to convince his attackers that he was insane. Eventually, prison became his home. Manson spent the majority of his first 32 years behind bars. Probation reports described Manson as one who suffers from a marked degree of rejection, instability, and psychic trauma, and he was also constantly striving for status and securing some kind of love. Other descriptions included unpredictable and safe only under supervision. It was while he was incarcerated that he learned how to read music and play the guitar, a hobby which would later ignite a passion to pursue a career in music. Which makes perfect sense. Music is a popular form of expression, as well as a common method for accruing adoring fans and followers. After his release in March of 1967, he moved to San Francisco, California, where he struck gold, so to speak. It was there that he began to develop the following that came to be known as the Manson family. The family was a group developed by Manson himself, consisting of around 100 members. To these followers, he instilled his passion for an unconventional lifestyle, wherein they regularly partook in the use of hallucinogenic drugs, i.e. magic mushrooms and LSD. Eventually, they moved from the Golden City to a deserted ranch in the San Fernando Valley, most likely to accommodate Manson's white supremacist belief in the oncoming apocalyptic race war. Their secluded residence would, according to his theory, shield them from the insurgency of black Americans against white Americans, which would result in a nuclear fallout. When the smoke cleared, he expected that his family would be the last group of white folk remaining. He believed that the family would be appointed leaders of this new world because of their perceived superiority over the black population, who was not intelligent enough to survive on their own. Charming. Manson was fixated on the Book of Revelation's notion of Armageddon, although I don't recall it saying literally anything about a race war, but go off. He also explored the obscure teachings of Scientology and the Church of the Final Judgment. Given his influence over his unit of impressionable followers, many of which were just young girls, they often believed without question in Manson's claims to be the second coming, as well as the news of the world's impending doom. Charles Manson's personality traits and obsessions resembled that of other gurus that spearheaded cult quasi-religious groups in the 1960s, something that had become rather popular therein, unfortunately. Manson was delusional, believing to be the harbinger of doom regarding the planet's future. Apologies for the tangent, but few things are as frustrating to me as a person or persons that use the authority of things like the Bible or other books of antiquity out of context to justify their prejudice and their misdeeds. Quite literally, the definition of taking God's name in vain, saying that God told you to do something that he most certainly did not. An unfortunate phenomenon that we see throughout history.
I think all these people are idiots. God.
But I digress. Manson was not only influenced by the drugs that were so commonplace in the family's household, but also by the art and music of the time. One of the more notable songs from which he drew inspiration was from the Beatles' 1968 White Album, a track entitled Helter Skelter. According to the Beatles' Paul McCartney, the playground slide in Helter Skelter was simply a metaphor for the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. However, Manson's interpretation of the song's lyrics were an incitation to set his imaginary apocalypse into motion. He used it as a means to justify his scheme and convince his followers to engage in horrific acts of murder. Manson's goal was to manually kickstart the race war by framing black populations for the crimes that his family would commit. He hoped that the acts that they would commit would stir the pot and stoke the interest of persons of color across the country to participate, thereby expediting the inevitable. His theory was that by targeting Hollywood's elite, aka the beautiful people, he would garner the most attention and springboard the beginnings of the end. The Manson family was responsible for various crimes and murders, but it was the Tate-LaBianca murders that profoundly shook America's perception of itself and effectively sounded the death knell of 60s counterculture. The disturbing methods of these murders also laid out a foundation for the rise of satanic panic that swept through the nation. The infamous murder spree began at one of Roman Polanski's homes just north of Beverly Hills in August of 1969. This sight for Manson would also allow him to exact revenge on the world of showbiz that denied him his route to fame. Not long before the incident, he had a brief encounter with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, which won him an audience with their producer, Terry Melcher. Melcher, who was staying at Polanski's house at the time, wasn't interested in signing with Manson. Though that didn't stop the Beach Boys from renaming one of his songs and using it in their 2020 album. I'm sure that didn't help matters. Fast forward to August 8th, 1969. Manson gathers 4 of his most loyal followers. Charles Tex Watson, a musician and former actor. Susan Atkins, nicknamed Sadie Mae Glutz. Patricia Krenwinkel, who went by various aliases, although to the family she was simply known as Katie. And Linda Kasabian, who would later become the key witness against the Manson family. The followers were instructed to travel to 10050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon, and to kill everyone there in the most gruesome manner that they could. Melcher himself was not present at the location, nor was Polanski, who was in London at the time, which was fortunate for the 2 of them, but not so much for the 5 soon-to-be victims that were returning home from dinner. The Manson family members arrived just past midnight, going into the early morning hours of the 9th of August. After cutting the phone line to the house, they left their car at the bottom of the hill of the estate and walked back up. The 4 of them entered the grounds by climbing a brushy embankment to to avoid any potential electric fences or tripping of alarms. Not long after, they spotted a set of headlights moving toward them. Tex told the three women to stay hidden in the bushes while he approached the oncoming vehicle. The driver was 18-year-old Stephen Parent, who had been visiting with William Garretson, the property's caretaker who resided in the guest house. Tex stopped the vehicle, brandishing a .22 caliber revolver. Parent, absolutely terrified, began to beg for his life, promising that he wouldn't say anything about their presence. Tex ignored his pleas and lunged at him through his car window with a knife, severing the tendons in the boy's palm, before shooting him 4 times in the chest and stomach. A sight which horrified Kasabian. After relocating Parent's vehicle, the body still inside, Kasabian was told to remain outside to keep watch and act as the getaway driver. It was there she began to contemplate the severity of the situation that she was now in. Tex proceeded into the house through a self-made hole in the screen window before letting Sadie Mae and Katie in the front door, where they found their next 4 victims. Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski's wife, Jay Sebring, one of her ex-boyfriends who was visiting, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folgers coffee fortune, and her boyfriend Wojtek Frykowski, who was also a friend of Polanski and an aspiring screenwriter. Folger had already retired to the guest room. Frykowski had passed out on the couch, while Tate and Sebring stayed up talking in another room. Frykowski was the first to be approached. He was still tired and disoriented from a full stomach and the recreational drugs in his system. Frykowski was unable to assess the danger of the situation and didn't respond initially when struck by the strange man in his living room. It wasn't until he noticed that he was staring down the barrel of a gun that he fearfully asked, "Who are you? What are you doing?" To which Tex responded, "I am the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." The assailants herded the remaining guests into the living room, where they proceeded to bind Sebring and Tate together by their necks via a rope that was slung over one of the beams in the ceiling. Jay Sebring attempted to protect Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant at the time, for which he was shot, kicked, and stabbed by Tex. Frykowski freed himself from the towel that was tied around his wrists and made a run for it through blades and beatings. Covered in blood, he staggered out of the house's front door but did not make it very far. He was caught and repeatedly bludgeoned and stabbed. Frykowski fought them off as best as he was able. Kasabian, who bore witness to the carnage, pleaded with his attackers to stop, but to no avail. Frykowski's autopsy would later reveal that he was stabbed a total of 51 times, bludgeoned 13 times, and shot twice. Meanwhile, his girlfriend Abigail Folger managed to flee through the bedroom door and into the pool area, pursued by Sadie Mae. She was tackled to the ground on the front lawn, where she was stabbed 28 times. When authorities found her body, they were unable to tell that the blood-red nightgown that she was still wearing had originally been white. Inside the house, Tate pleaded for the life of her unborn child, offering herself as a hostage in exchange for its safety. Sadie Mae Glutz coldly responded, "Look, I have no mercy for you. You're going to die, and you'd better get used to it." Tate was then stabbed 16 times. Her blood was used to write the word pig on the house's front door. Instead of being happy with the success of their outing, Manson criticized the 4 of them for being sloppy. The following night, Manson took family members Tex, Katie, and Leslie Van Houten to the Los Feliz address of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, where the couple was murdered in a similarly brutal manner. Their hands were bound and pillowcases placed over their heads, tied in place with lamp cords around their necks. The LaBiancas fought to survive, but were overwhelmed by the unexpected attack and the number of violent assailants. Manson ensured the participation of each of his family members present by having them take turns stabbing the victims, whether with a chrome bayonet or utensils from the LaBianca's own kitchen. Lino was stabbed approximately 10 times with a knife and 7 times with a 2-tined fork, which was left protruding from his stomach, and the knife from his throat. Rosemary suffered 41 stab wounds in total. They decorated the walls with more bloodied graffiti, like "Rise" and "Death to Pigs," and wrote "Helter Skelter" on the refrigerator door. The word "war" was carved into Lino's abdomen. The couple's bodies were left in their home for their children to discover the following day. In total, the Manson family was thought to have carried out approximately 35 killings. Most of their cases were never tried, partially due to lack of evidence, and/or the fact that many of the assailants were already serving out life sentences. Ironically, the members of the family weren't originally arrested for the Tate LaBianca murders. Instead, they were arrested for comparatively trivial matters like the vandalization of part of Death Valley's National Park during their time hiding out in the Mojave Desert, or the suspected involvement in a major auto theft ring. It wasn't until Sadie Mae Glutz, or Susan Atkins if you recall, was booked for the suspected involvement in the murder of Gary Hinman that she let loose a confession that connected the Manson family to the Tate LaBianca murders. Detectives finally had a promising lead after having collected so much of their evidence from independent sources. By December of 1969, each of the Manson family members involved in the heinous acts of violence were apprehended. The trial began June 15, 1970. Linda Kasabian had willingly turned herself in and chose to serve as the prosecution's main witness. She, along with Manson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Katie Krenwinkel, had been charged with 7 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Charles Tex Watson fought extradition to California long enough that he was not tried with Manson and the others. Given the fact that Kasabian did not participate in the actual killings, she was granted immunity in exchange for testimony detailing the nights of the crimes. The Manson murder trial was the longest murder trial in American history, lasting 9.5 months. It was dubbed the Trial of the Century and was among the most publicized American criminal cases of the 20th century. The jury had been sequestered for 225 days, longer than any jury prior. Its transcript alone was 31,716 pages, or 209 volumes. The trial itself was full of eccentricities. On Friday, July 24th, the first day of testimony, Manson appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead, which was later modified into a swastika, stating that he had X'd himself from the establishment's world. The female defendants followed in his example, as did many members of the Manson family, who showed up in support of their leader, loitering near the entrance and corridors of the courthouse. They threatened to immolate themselves if Manson was convicted, and discouraged witnesses from testifying. Eventually forced outside, they established a vigil on the sidewalk. They weren't hard to identify, some of them wearing sheathed hunting knives in plain view, with the aforementioned X's carved into their foreheads. According to Krenwinkel in a later interview, the entire scene was scripted by Manson himself. The defendants showed no remorse, often exchanging grimaces and making faces with one another. Nothing was sacred to them. No one was off limits. Manson himself attempted to attack Judge Older. Like a deranged, off-brand John Wick, he lunged at the judge with a pencil in hand, but was wrestled to the ground by bailiffs. Manson was removed from the courtroom, as were his female counterparts, who subsequently began chanting in Latin. Judge Older reportedly began wearing a revolver under his robes as a safety precaution, which, who could blame him? The body of Ronald Hughes, defense attorney for Leslie Van Houten, was found in Ventura County, decomposing between 2 boulders on the day the verdicts recommending the death penalty were returned. Although never proven, it was rumored that he was murdered by the family, most likely since he refused to allow Van Houten to take the stand and absolve Manson of his crimes. Sandra Good, a member of the Manson family, stated that Hughes was the first of the retaliation murders. After months of chaos and deliberation, a verdict was reached. On January 25, 1971, the jury found Charles Manson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Susan Atkins guilty of first-degree murder in all 7 of the Tate and LaBianca killings. Van Houten was guilty of murder in the first degree in the LaBianca killings alone. On March 29, 1971, the jury sentenced the 4 of them to death, a sentence which was later commuted to life in prison after California's Supreme Court invalidated all death sentences prior to 1972. As previously mentioned, Linda Kasabian was granted immunity for her role as star witness, as well as her lack of involvement in the murders. She went on to testify against Tex Watson, who received his own separate trial in 1971, and against Leslie Van Houten, who in 1977 had 2 retrials. Manson served his time in California's Corcoran State Prison. He was denied parole for the 12th time in 2012. On November 19th, 2017, Charles Manson died of natural causes. He had been in prison for more than 40 years for his crimes. There is much debate over Manson's mental health, whereas he was never officially assessed or diagnosed with anything, given his refusal to work with prison psychiatrists. Nowadays, people question the legitimacy of Manson's own belief in the race war that he perpetuated and suggest alternative motivations for his crimes. This question, however, is one we will never know the answer to, and is honestly irrelevant in our assessment of his character. Here's what we do know. Manson was smart enough to minimize his own physical involvement in the murders, to manipulate the thinking of others, to terrorize the public, to distort and gaslight the thoughts of anyone within close proximity of his words and philosophies. Even in death, his unmistakably evil influence holds an unfortunate sway. Charles Manson's case is in some ways a sad one. Knowing a person's developmental history helps us to understand what motivates them. But that doesn't mean it excuses their horrible misdeeds, nor does it absolve them of accountability for their actions. Few things are as terrifying as a violent fool with a passionate flock. Thankfully, there hasn't been anyone recently in power with a twisted misunderstanding of the Bible, motivated by their own racial prejudice, whipping the public into a frenzy. We need to be careful to ensure that our fixation on these criminal minds doesn't result in a sympathetic condoning or disregard for their terrible acts. Many of us have traumatic experiences and backgrounds, but that does not entitle us to bring harm to others, whether physically or emotionally. It is up to us to assess ourselves and to get help when necessary so that we can break the chains of violence that we are often involuntarily subjected to. I pray that this finds you well. In the meantime, this is Thaddeus, reminding you to be cautious of wolves in sheep's clothing.